It's my distinct pleasure on behalf of the Board of Trustees and the staff of the Drayton Hall Preservation Trust to introduce tonight's speaker. But first, just want to briefly reflect on Yale. Dean Jonathan Holloway, the Dean of Yale College, Drayton Hall, what's the connection? And I think just looking at our calendar of events as far as the Distinguished Speaker Series, this being the second event of the spring of this year, we always strive to make connections between distinguished speakers, professionals, academics in the nation, and what's happening at Drayton Hall. So from our staff, Trish Smith presented last month, to Sarah Stroud-Clark, our archaeologist and curator of collections, presenting in September, to Jonathan tonight, there are connections between the work that's happening on site and around the nation. Now, the connection between Drayton Hall and Yale, there were several of us a few years ago that had the opportunity to travel to Yale to complete a fellowship in public history. And through that, we were immersed in the incredible scholarship happening at Yale in African American history. And so it was a natural fit to bring a scholar back from Yale to Charleston to not only discuss African American history, its current status in the nation, but its relevance to Drayton Hall. So a pleasure to introduce Jonathan Holloway tonight. Jonathan is the Dean of Yale College and the Edmund S. Morgan Professor of African American Studies, History, and American Studies at Yale. He specializes in post-emancipation United States history with a focus on social and intellectual history. He's the author of Confronting the Veil, Abraham Harris Jr., E. Franklin Fraser, and Ralph Bunche, and Jim Crow Wisdom, Memory and Identity in Black America since 1940, both published with the University of North Carolina Press. He edited Ralph Bunche's A Brief and Tentative Analysis of Negro Literature, and co-edited Black Scholars on the Line, Race, Social Justice, and American Thought in the 20th Century. He's written and introduced for a new edition on W.B. Du Bois, Souls of Black Folk, published by Yale University Press in 2015. He's held fellowships from the W.B. Du Bois Research Institute at Harvard University, the Stanford Humanities Center, and the Ford Foundation. He's also an Alphonse Fletcher Senior Fellow in 2011, 2012, and is currently the Distinguished Lecturer for the Organization for American Historians. Without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce Dean Jonathan Holloway.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm so glad you're here. I was nervous there might be 10 people. And of those 10, I know 5, so that would have been pretty rough. It has been an absolute delight to be here. This is, it snowed in New Haven on Sunday, and so there's that part of it. When I was invited to be part of this lecture series, I will confess I looked for when Yale's spring break was, and thinking it might snow in New Haven, said, well, this date I'm free, and stretched that date into a week. So my wife and son have been with me. They're not here tonight. They've heard me yap enough. We all came down on Sunday night. We missed the snowstorm, thankfully, and have had the most delightful time in Charleston. None of us had been here before. We have already started thinking about when we come back. I'm guessing next spring break. And I'm not just saying that to be nice to all of you. This is the real plan. We might need that long to recover from not what we've eaten, but how much we've eaten. That's a challenge for local folks. I'm impressed to see how you manage. One very true story, I had the delightful privilege of being a guest at Bill Kennard's and Deborah Kennedy's house on Tuesday evening, and we stayed there a very long time. We were walking back home at 10:45 at night, and just walking up Meeting Street, and just beautiful, and stopped in a local store, I think it's called Peace Pies, ice cream sandwiches with this layer of pie. I mean, this is what I'm talking about. And it was 5 minutes before closing. And no one wants a new customer walking in 5 minutes before closing. And the gentleman who was working there saw our son, our 12-year-old son, very quiet and shy, and saw he was carrying a book. I love that book. And they spent all this time talking about the book before they got around to the ice cream sandwiches. Got his ice cream sandwiches, were walking away, and Ellison, our son, had already been talking about what a great time he had at dinner. And as we're walking away, about close to Marion Square, I suppose, he goes, "Why can't people in Connecticut be this nice?" If that's not an advertisement for this city, I don't know what it is. It has been truly a delight to have been here all of this week. I want to offer my thanks, of course, for being invited in the first place. Was Steve writing to me, I think it was a year and a half ago. It was a complicated schedule to get here, inviting me down. I'm honored by that. By Carter Hudgens for his hospitality, for No, really. I promise. For Steve Gates for his great support of Drayton Hall, for Tara Odom, who just took us under her wing and showed us around Drayton Hall for the better part of a day, and this is a small world. Jennifer, who picked me up from the hotel to come here, she wanted to know how long I've been teaching at Yale, and I told her it's been 17 years or so, and she goes, "Well, I have a couple of friends who teach at Groton now who went to Yale." And I started laughing because her dear friends she knows who went to Yale, I grew up with in high school. So it feels like everything has been aligning to come for me to be here and to have a great time. I want to thank as well the Carolina Club where I had lunch today, and of course the Society Hall for this event. The Yale Club of Charleston, I found out, advertised for this. I'm honored by that as well. And a special acknowledgement because Yale is very dear to me, the friends I make there, to the Worrell family who had us over for drinks that turned into a 4-hour event with dinner involved. And then to the Etts, Rachel, who was, when I was the master of Calhoun College, is one of mine, and I like to think that I'm one of hers. So it's just wonderful to be with family. So thank you all. I had this morning the occasion to meet with Mayor Riley, former Mayor Riley. I think he'll always be Mayor Riley, I suppose. And we talked about his plans for this museum on Gadsden Wharf. And he just wanted to sound me out and hear my thoughts on these things, and I don't know, what do I think about the state of museums and race and telling these kinds of stories that are often difficult and painful stories. And he said, we need in this country, not just in Charleston, in this country, to find a way to secure reconciliation. Honest reconciliation. Not celebration, that's the easier part, but honest, hard reconciliation. I quite agree. And the only way to get there is to talk to one another and to listen to one another and to engage one another. And I fully believe that his plans for the museum that he wants to help realize is going to be one of these vehicles for talking and listening and engaging and for reconciliation. And for it to happen, as I was saying today during lunch, to have this museum sited here in Charleston, the gateway of a certain type for so many African Americans in this country, is critically important. It's of national importance, I believe. Now, when I was invited to give this lecture, I was very happy to be able to don my professor's cap and take off my dean's mantles. I don't get to wear the professor's hat. I don't know what that metaphor is about. I don't get to be just Professor Holloway that often anymore. I don't get to talk about my scholarship that much anymore. And I was wondering if I would get that chance today, after we had a very complicated fall on Yale's campus. Some of you, maybe many of you know about it. And I just want you to know, I'm happy during Q&A to talk about it, but I'm going to be wearing my professor's hat and not my dean's mantle. And I'll be talking as the scholar instead of the person who navigated or helped to navigate an extremely difficult period on Yale's campus. It's a nationally difficult moment. Now, the reason I mention that is not just a disclaimer of sorts, but because so much of the student unrest at Yale, around the nation, I truly believe was because too many people felt invisible, felt they had not been heard in some fashion or another, that their stories didn't matter, that their challenges didn't matter. Students in Yale's case in particular felt, I believe wrongly in some ways, and I said as much, but rightly in other ways, that once they were admitted to Yale, Yale just said, great, you've been admitted, you're part of this Yale family. And wasn't doing enough, and they felt wasn't doing enough of work to listen to their experiences. Now, I really want to believe when we admitted these students to Yale, every student becomes part of Yale. That's the way I look at it. They're all part of what my home institution is about. But I do think the administration, myself included, simply wasn't doing enough to make it clear that we wanted to listen to their stories, understand their histories and their pasts. That these students felt very hyper-visible, but also quite invisible. And it's actually thematically linked to what I'm going to be talking about today. The challenge of negotiating being so visible that you cannot be seen anymore. It may sound a bit strange. I'll walk through it in the talk itself. We really put ourselves at risk as a university, as a city, as a nation, if we presume that just because we can see somebody, we actually know their story. We need to know their stories. We can't let them be invisible. It's one of the lessons I really took to heart this fall, and something that as you'll see, I talk about in my scholarship. So I want to, with that being said, I want to offer a reading instead of giving sort of informal off-the-cuff remarks as I've been doing now, a traditional academic reading of my very latest scholarship. It's a selection from a chapter that'll be in a book that I believe comes out this fall called The Futures of Atlantic Intellectual History. I'm an intellectual historian by trade, a historian of ideas. And this is my contribution to this anthology. And it's thinking about race in what we call the Black Atlantic world. And I'll explain some of that in the detail. So I'll be doing a reading. I want to begin this reading, though, with an epigram that I used to open up my book, Jim Crow Wisdom. It applies there as well as it applies to this moment. A bit of background. It's a poem by Lucille Clifton called Why Some People Be Mad at Me Sometimes. Lucille Clifton just passed away, I think 2 years ago, perhaps. Great, great poet, a native daughter of Maryland, had been invited by the Maryland State Legislature, I don't remember the year, to write a poem. She was the poet laureate of Maryland, to write a poem in honor of maybe a sesquicentennial, some anniversary that was important to Maryland's history. And they asked her to write a poem that reflected the theme, our happy colonial days. Lucille Clifton's African American. And she paused and mused that, well, some colonial days were happier for some than others, and wrote a couple different poems that they were not happy with. And she eventually wrote a poem, I actually don't know what that poem is, but wrote a different poem that was really her poem about happy colonial days. And it frames my talk. And I'll go from the poem into the talk itself. They ask me to remember, but they want me to remember their memories. And I keep remembering mine. In 2007, and in honor of the bicentennial of the abolition of the British slave trade, the Yale Center for British Art mounted an exhibit titled Art and Emancipation in Jamaica, Isaac Mendez Belisario and His Worlds. This exhibit, an impressive showing of hundreds of paintings, figures, maps, and sculpture, revolved around a series of 12 lithographs that Mendez produced, called together Sketches of Character, an illustration of the habits, occupation, and costume of the Negro populations in the island of Jamaica. These lithographs depicted slaves in masquerade during holiday seasons, or black street vendors selling wares, and collectively serve as a remarkable series of snapshots of life at the colonial margins of the Atlantic slave world. This is one image of what's called a set girl. I'm not going to linger over, but this is these beautiful lithographs and slave dressed in costume during what I would simply call an emancipated moment. She was never free, but was allowed to dress up in performance on this occasion. Perhaps more remarkable than Belisario's images, however, is the fact that the Center for British Art mounted the exhibit in the first place. Even though the center is dedicated to the collection of paintings, sculptures, prints, drawings, etc., reflecting the development of British art and life from the Elizabethan period forward, and even though Belisario's work had long been part of the museum's collections, it wasn't until Art and Emancipation that the Center for British Art assembled an exhibit that was so deeply concerned with the role of race and slavery in the making of the British Empire. The ubiquity of white European subjects in the British art collection made it difficult for curators to see what had been absent for so long from their own collections, their own exhibitions, pardon me, representations of blackness in the Atlantic world. Art and Emancipation, the exhibit, reflects a larger shift in curatorial consciousness as it relates to the role of the black figure in sites of public history and culture. In terms of history and art museums, this is a shift that can trace its roots in the United States most clearly back to the 1960s, the rise of the Black arts movement, and the waning moments of the Civil Rights Revolution, when community activists began to establish institutional spaces in which their experiences would be welcomed. The changes in collections and collection management from the 1960s onward had a parallel at universities in the United States as Black Studies programs were established, a response to the civil rights battles as well as to new recruitment programs that targeted Black students, hoping to bring them to historically white colleges and universities. As the pressure grew to create Black Studies programs, the role of blackness, Black bodies themselves, literally Black bodies, and then the significance of a Black cultural and historical experience drove debates among students and faculties about what had value and what was worth knowing. Although curricular offerings evolved over the course of the 1970s and 1980s, the debates about the Black absence/presence on US campuses tended to repeat itself with a numbing predictability, and that's what I was referencing in my opening comments as well. As much as we find ourselves in new days, history keeps coming back and repeating itself. Anyway, these debates changed significantly in 1993 when sociologist Paul Gilroy published a book called The Black Atlantic, Modernity and Double Consciousness. By looking at the Atlantic, as he referred to it, as one single complex unit of analysis, Gilroy hoped his readers would think in new ways about evidence that surrounded them but had yet remained invisible. If Gilroy's readers could do this, they would see that the terms upon which Black studies and the Black experience were understood needed to be broadened and deepened. Gilroy argued that the organizing symbol for this reconceptualization was the ocean-going ship in which so much of Africanity entered the modern world. These trading vessels that crossed the oceans were, in his words, living microcultural, micropolitical systems in motion that represented national and imperial ventures and in which ideas and values met and clashed. Even if one felt that a dominant culture emerged from these encounters, it would be naive to believe that such a culture remained unscathed and that the so-called weaker culture folded, as it were, to Black. Unveiling a Black presence, that is, shining light on what had been considered an empty space, only to discover it was already occupied, destabilized assertions of cultural purity, and compelled people to think about ways in which black bodies and a black perspective shaped empire. As compelling as Gilroy's formulation was for a new generation of intellectuals, however, deploying the Black Atlantic as a unit of analysis was challenging. The most difficult aspect of this work was the need to assess and incorporate the absences that are endemic to the black world. To point to the most horrifying aspect of this project, scholars who were trying to study the Black Atlantic had to find ways to reconcile the vast impossibilities of the Atlantic Ocean, that the Atlantic Ocean presented, as it was a watery burial site for untold numbers of Africans. The Atlantic Ocean was a space literally teeming with data that was actually unknowable. So many stories drowned at the bottom of the ocean. Gilroy's call was more than a suggestion that scholars should expand and complicate their frame of reference and inquiry when thinking about blackness and its relationship to the world. It was also a recognition of a larger shift in consciousness about the connection of the black experience to modernity and an invitation to find value or meaning in new spaces. In fits and starts, the shift was already happening in the public sphere as museum professionals and artists throughout the Black Atlantic world were increasingly crafting interpretive responses or making interpretive gestures that used the idea of a diasporic consciousness, something that had been invisible to so many for so long, using this new consciousness as a new unit of analysis to understand black life and the relationship of this life to narratives of empire, economics, politics, and culture. Of particular interest in my talk is how curators have wrestled with the presence of absence, how they've wrestled with the presence of absence, how they have attempted to identify and give meaning to what had once been thought to be beyond knowing or not worth worrying about because it was deemed invisible. Taking a survey of public sites of history and culture in the Black Atlantic world, specifically New Haven, Connecticut, Liverpool, England, Baton Rouge, and New Orleans, Louisiana, and Bridgetown, Barbados, taking a survey of these sites reveals the challenges that curators have faced when thinking in new ways about what can be known, what is worth knowing, and most importantly, what racial absence can tell us about the construction of empire and citizenship. New Haven. The fall 2014 Yale Center for British Art exhibit, Figures of Empire, Slavery and Portraiture in 18th Century Atlantic Britain, addresses this challenge directly. The curatorial staff assembled Figures of Empire in part because of the breakthrough success of the Art and Emancipation exhibit, where I showed you the one image at the beginning of the lecture, but more importantly, because they were increasingly frustrated by the challenges in finding some narrative connection between the so-called whiteness of the British Art Center collections and the significant number of black students from the local school districts who visited the museum. In planning this exhibit, British Art Center curators scoured the center's collections for art that featured black subjects in some way. Even though the black figures they found were typically subservient to other subjects in the frame, the sheer number of pieces in the collection in which black people were present surprised curators. In fact, they thought they might find a dozen, 30, or 40. They found 300 different items in their collection that they never noticed before had black subjects in it. Black subjects, it turns out, were not actually absent from the Yale Center for British Art collections at all. People had been looking past their presence, and in so doing, rendering them absent. Fairly typical of what curators found is the painting of Elihu Yale, the wealthy merchant for whom the university is named. Here, Elihu Yale is seated with several men of high standing in the respective worlds of politics and business. And I'm going to apologize just because it's so bright over there. You won't get quite the detail that, I'll walk you through it. Anyway, so here's Elihu Yale sitting with men of high standing in the respective worlds of politics and business. To their collective left, let me see if I can, there we go. Is my mouse present? Okay. And the colors are off too. See, that would drive a historian of art absolutely crazy. But to their collective left is an unnamed page. He's a dark-skinned black boy who is tending to the men's needs. He is well-dressed, but a close look reveals that he has a locked collar around his neck. Right here. It looks like a ruffle, if you can maybe make it out. I know it's, You just have to trust me on this. It looks like a nice white ruffle, but it's actually a metal collar with a lock on it. Curators know little more about this painting than this, and they certainly know nothing about the page beyond the fact that this figure, the black slave, is both a literal and figurative affirmation of power that he himself does not have. Whether a figurative symbol or a literal person, it is the anonymity of the page in the portrait that registers clearly. That the page in the Yale portrait is anonymous confirms the intellectual commitment by the propertied and cultural elite to deny, at a fundamental level, the presence of those upon whom they depended for their comfort and who marked their social status. It was actually a phenomenon in British portraiture to have a black page somewhere in the painting, because that affirmed your standing in the world. As it happens, there are other portraits of Elihu Yale that are owned by the university, some displayed, some warehoused. In one version, Elihu Yale is seated facing the viewer while representations of his material wealth surround him. In a nod to Yale's trade, ships are at harbor in this painting over his shoulder. Ships are at harbor in the distance. At his knee, and this is very hard to, I gotta see what you guys see. It's very hard to make out in the wash of light. But at his elbow, at his knee, is a black person in native dress who is shackled. The formal attire that the page wears in other British Art Center painting is gone. And while it is obvious that both black boys are slaves, there is less subterfuge in this painting. It is almost as if the artists were experimenting with how best to capture Elihu Yale's standing in the world. Okay, what I can see is, again, another image of a collar, with a locked collar around his neck. That the merchant Yale's social position, visually hinged upon an anonymous black body, metaphorically underscores blacks' roles in shaping meaning in the Atlantic world. Posing a more robust interpretive challenge to the British Art Center curators than Elihu Yale's paintings is William Hogarth's Portrait of a Family. Hogarth, a popular 18th century painter and satirist, was a critic of the British elite, in particular its ostentatious displays of material wealth. Like fellow artists, Hogarth frequently used black figures in his work, but in Hogarth's hands, black servants and slaves, indeed most everything in his paintings, offered sardonic commentaries on British culture and taste. In Portrait of a Family, we find Hogarth at work and at play. His subjects may represent the typical British elite, but they are portrayed in atypical style. Everything is in motion. Life is unordered. Although a commissioned portrait, the painting lacks a self-affirming narrative. Here we find a teenager, over here, a teenager perhaps, with a glazed look on his face while he pets a lapdog, a kitten oblivious to everything, but a toppled basket of sewing material in front of it, an unkempt table with a plate about to fall off, two couples engaging in domestic activities together, but barely acknowledging one another, one woman surreptitiously pulling a handkerchief from the pocket of a standing figure, this same figure leaning against a chair, pointing off to the distance for no reason. It isn't so much a portrait, but a collection of bodies occupying a space, a tableau, but seemingly without an accompanying story behind what boredom or mischief could provide. A closer inspection, though, and I'm afraid you're not going to be able to see it in this projection. I'm not making this stuff up, so it's really there. A closer inspection, however, compels the viewer to follow the standing figure's gesture over here. He's pointing right here. And what you may be able to see, you can see it with the actual painting in front of you, I assure you. He is pointing to a black servant, barely in the frame, a fragment of a fragment. The servant is in motion as well, bringing in a platter bearing a small cup for the tea service. The servant yields no larger meaning, but its placement forces the question, why so barely there? In Portrait of a Family, then, we find an artist critical of the British elite's practice of requesting that black servants and slaves be in their portraits as markers of influence and wealth placing, but barely a servant in his own painting of the commissioning family. Is Hogarth offering the viewer a glance behind the curtain of elite life? Might the standing figure be pointing to the servant as if to assure the viewer that this family, despite its disorder, had the resources to own help? Might the standing figure be pointing to the individual who actually brings order and perhaps even meaning to the family's life? A definitive answer to these questions is beyond the scope of this presentation, and in truth, beyond what curators felt comfortable or confident claiming. But the larger point remains clear. In the context of the Yale Center for British Art, the Art and Emancipation in Jamaica and Figures of Empire exhibits moved the black subject into the center of an evolving conversation about the role of blackness in the making of the Atlantic world. The black figure, previously present as only an abstraction, absent as a known human, was now viewed as vital to the making and marking of the idea of empire. Liverpool. Just as the British Art Center's curators' efforts represented a new direction in addressing what had been the lingering absence of a black presence in their institution's exhibition practice, museum professionals and citizens in Liverpool were moving aggressively toward examining the silences in their city's slave trading past. Acknowledging that certain absences could not be recovered, Liverpool curators still pressed forward, recognizing that they had an ethical obligation to at least address the silences. In the second half of the 18th century, Liverpool was one of the world's most active ports in the transatlantic slave trade and was one of only 3 English cities sanctioned to participate in that trade. Immense wealth came to the city during this era, only to have it vanish when the trade was abolished and when the city proved unable to prepare for or weather subsequent economic shocks. In the late 20th century, when it came to the city's history, its residents seemed mostly interested in Liverpool's role as the birthplace of the Beatles. It wasn't until, it's actually funny, I was in Liverpool last summer for a conference, and a cab driver was just chatting away, and he was explaining the growth of Liverpool, and it is a boom city right now. And he goes, frankly, in an accent that makes it even funnier, frankly, to me, but I'm not going to try the accent. He goes, frankly, it all kind of amazes me. Welcome to Liverpool. We had a band. Oh, that's all he said. In the 20th century, when it came to the city's history, its residents seemed mostly interested in Liverpool's role as the birthplace of the Beatles. It wasn't until the late 1980s and early 1990s when this began to change. Then, amidst the abiding Beatlemania, the city's black and white activists successfully lobbied the Maritime Museum to acknowledge the city's involvement in the slave trade. The National Museum's Liverpool, which is the administrative body overseeing the Maritime Museum and other museums at the city's Albert Docks, the National Museum's Liverpool set about designing an exhibit that would catalog the local history of the slave trade and the larger global slave economy. The exhibit, titled Transatlantic Slavery, Against Human Dignity, opened in 1994. Despite being housed in the basement of the Maritime Museum, the exhibit hit a nerve, and traffic to the museum doubled immediately. After the success of the Transatlantic Slavery Gallery, other exhibits began to appear throughout England. And although these were mostly temporary exhibits, a new way of thinking about England's relationship with its past was increasingly evident. As England approached the bicentennial of the abolition of the slave trade, Liverpudlians' commitment to tell a more complex history of their past intensified. In 2007, the bicentennial year of the abolition of the slave trade, the Transatlantic Slavery exhibit moved from the basement of the Maritime Museum to the new International Slavery Museum, the first of its kind in the world, housed on the 3rd floor of the same building, where it became part of an expanded collection examining historic and contemporary forced labor. At the gala dinner celebrating the opening of the museum, David Fleming, the director of National Museums Liverpool, made a powerful declaration about the need to remember the histories of racial slavery and its legacies in Liverpool and beyond. And I quote at some length here. "The day will come when it is impossible to imagine a pleasant and articulate black Liverpool teenager being excluded from his school for resisting racial hostility and physical attacks from his white schoolmates. But that day has not yet come. The day will come when it is impossible to imagine that a young man should be murdered by white thugs on the streets of Liverpool simply because he was black. Tragically, that day has not yet come, neither in Liverpool nor in any other British city. And it is because that day has not yet come that the International Slavery Museum is needed. It is needed, yes, to help illuminate one of the darker, more shameful and neglected areas in our history, an era in which this city played a pivotal role. As well as this, he continued, it is needed because the consequences of that era are all around us in the shape of a rich and vibrant multinational, multiracial Atlantic world, but also in inequality of opportunity, racial prejudice, ignorance, intolerance, and hatred. And these evils will not be overcome through denial or through wishful thinking. They have to be tackled head on, and the most potent weapon at our disposal is education, the essence of museums, and the essence of the International Slavery Museum. The museum itself is divided into thirds. Visitors enter the museum where artifacts that one would find in a West African village are on display. It is a well-done but fairly traditional presentation, one step beyond the glass case dioramas that fill staid natural history museums. The middle third of the museum focuses upon the enslaved experience, from life on a sugarcane plantation to the journey through the Middle Passage itself. Very powerful part of the museum. The final third of the museum explores the legacies of slavery. There, visitors find exhibits examining current human rights abuses around the globe. These exhibits are designed to make clear that slavery is not merely a past phenomenon that is unconnected to the present. More pointedly, they introduce the contemporary visitor to systems of commerce in which they may actively participate that have connections to political repression or forced labor. Even though some of the museum curators pushed for a museum that was explicitly neutral in its presentation, museum director Richard Benjamin endorsed Fleming's perspective. The museum was not a neutral site. It had a clear agenda, and it should not shy away from it. This consciousness is an acknowledgement that no site is neutral and underscores the fact that curators have always been shaping ideas and notions of what is normal, identifying what could be seen, whether they acknowledge the role in the practice or not. Immediately next door to the International Slavery Museum is the Tate Liverpool, the most visited gallery of modern and contemporary art in England outside of London. In 2010, the museum continued its own agenda of, quote, delivering a diverse program and generating debate when it presented Afro-Modern, Journeys Through the Black Atlantic. Inspired directly by Paul Gilroy's book, The Black Atlantic, this exhibition explored the impact of different black cultures from around the Atlantic world, from 1909 to 2009. Accepting Gilroy's challenge to envision Liverpool as a capital of the Black Atlantic, the curators felt that Afro-Modern reflects on the notion that the Atlantic Ocean is a continent in negative, a network of cultures connecting Africa, North and South America, the Caribbean and Europe, and traces the real and imagined routes taken across the Atlantic. The exhibition opens up an alternative transatlantic reading of modernism and its impact on contemporary culture. Thelma Golden, the curator and director of the Studio Museum in Harlem, confirmed as much in a conversation with art historian Huey Copeland. In response to Copeland's question about how Gilroy's articulation of the Black Atlantic changed Golden's curatorial strategy, this is for the exhibit catalog, Golden compared the founding mission statement of the Studio Museum to the current one. The original mission statement read, "The Studio Museum in Harlem collects, presents, and interprets works of African American artists and artifacts of the African diaspora." The current mission statement states, "The Studio Museum in Harlem is the nexus for black artists locally, nationally, and internationally, and for work that has been inspired by black culture. It is a site for the dynamic exchange of ideas about art and society." Golden explained that when the museum was founded in 1968, it was responding to the cultural movements of the 1960s that claimed Africa as an inspiration, but felt that, quote, Africa was our past and Afro-America was our present. In 2009, at the time of the interview, the museum's curatorial practice reflected a changed sensibility that recognized a global black presence in a way that created some parity to the differences in our histories without necessarily needing to line them up with Black American history. This was Gilroy's Black Atlantic thesis put into practice. In the same interview, artist Glenn Ligon agreed with Golden that artistic and curatorial practice had changed in the wake of the Black Atlantic. Ligon pointed to, quote, the substantial dialogue between artists on his side of the Atlantic, the Americas, and artists in Africa as well, as with African artists living in the United States, as the source for his rethinking of what is possible. Ligon used his new orientation to ask questions that demonstrated an understanding of blackness operating outside of a domestic or United States sphere. I forgot to offer a caveat. This is art, sometimes it's graphic. I present it in the way that it's presented. For example, in his work, Gold, Nobody Knew Me, #1, Ligon used humor to speak about black Americans longing for what one can call a naively constructed black Atlantic lineage. Using acrylic and oil stick on canvas, Ligon transcribed comedian Richard Pryor's confused lament that I closely paraphrase. I went to Africa. I went to the motherland to find my roots, right? 700 million black people. Not one of those mothers knew me. Just want to be polite. Pryor's joke, laden with pathos, addressed so many black Americans' 1970s post-Roots, as in Alex Haley Roots, post-Roots confusion that the Africa they now wanted to see as a homeland did not automatically welcome them back. Africa was not a tabula rasa upon which sojourning black Americans could fashion their imagined perceptions. Pryor's realization and Ligon's reframing spoke to the ruptures that are fundamentally part of understanding the Black Atlantic as a unit of analysis. What feels like the absence of a knowable past and the longing for some sort of affirming narrative is paralyzing to many. Gilroy, however, argued that absence created the opportunity for the understanding that identities were fundamentally unstable and mutable. Caribbean art historian and curator Patrine Archer agreed with Gilroy's assessment. Diaspora blacks can no longer trace a straight line to an African past via ritual and traditions. Instead, they must acknowledge and embrace a global citizenship that is syncretic and culturally diverse. The recognition that rupture and absence demand a new and perhaps liberating perspective is found throughout Afro-modern. Tanya Barson, the lead curator for Afro-modern, pointed out that artists understood the need for interpretive boldness in the face of silence or erasure. The artists, she claimed, felt that they could depict and interpret the physical, cultural, and psychological violence of the Middle Passage and dislocation through the strategy of representing historical narratives in the absence of adequate records by imaginative recovery. Imaginative recoveries, like those that end with a gesture to an impossible connection, as with Glenn Ligon's Gold Nobody Knew Me #1, imaginative recoveries do important work, certainly, but they also remind the public of the yawning and terrible power of absence. These are absences that are profoundly present and are manifested as figurative yearnings for that which cannot be known or had. Baton Rouge and New Orleans. Curators in Louisiana had long been familiar with the challenges that absence produces. Over the course of the last 15 years, curators' sensibilities about how to address that absence changed. Increasingly, curators could be found mining archives in new ways and finding data that previous scholars swore did not exist. At the same time, the curators freely admitted that some of the artifacts that they would want to examine, most poignantly the bones of African slaves, were quite inaccessible, even though the curators knew where to find them. What one finds in the curator's intervention in Louisiana, just as could be seen in New Haven and Liverpool, is a conscious effort to write a new narrative about how an unobserved blackness operated in the Atlantic world and how acknowledging it changed the narrative of the present. But telling a new story about an old place was not a simple matter of updating a script based upon new evidence and interpretation. For example, in recent years, curators at Baton Rouge's Magnolia Mound plantation have been chipping away at an older, more traditional narrative that focused their attention on the plantation house. As late as 1999, for example, tour guides at the Magnolia Mound plantation declared that the site did not have any records about the slaves who had worked on the plantation. In the place of this absence, the guides developed a narrative about the Magnolia Mound slaves. They fleshed out the story, as it were, based on secondary literature about Louisiana sugarcane plantation slave systems, but not about Magnolia Mound specifically. At the turn of the 21st century, and under the leadership of a new manager, who also happened to be a trained archaeologist, pursuing a more nuanced engagement with the past, the Magnolia Mound plantation script had been aggressively rewritten. Previously, visitors to the site only had a structured tour of the plantation house and the kitchen house. The rest of the outside grounds were open to visitors, but without curatorial guidance. In 1998, a slave cabin was relocated to the Magnolia Mound site. The original cabins hadn't survived, but it was not yet woven into the guided tours of the plantation. In the new Magnolia Mound script, slaves' presence became marked throughout the tour. Every room in the big house, for example, was a site where free and slave interacted. The tour now continued outside of the plantation house, and the slave cabin was incorporated into the broader narrative about life on the plantation. Archaeological digs had unearthed an entire narrative about how slaves lived at Magnolia Mound. Furthermore, extensive genealogical research projects at the turn of the century revealed that there were extensive records about the enslaved people who lived at Magnolia Mound. Now, tour guides could talk about Josephine, Bathsheba, Abram, Fanny, Dick, Harry, and another 45 slaves who lived in 16 cabins in the slave quarters. This did not mean that the interpretive challenges had been surmounted, nor could they ever be. In truth, the difficult work was only just beginning. Now that Magnolia Mound's enslaved people had names, and now that the curators had a better sense of how they lived, the curators' commitment to understanding and projecting the complete story of Magnolia Mound only intensified. Curators made sure to incorporate the restored slave cabin into the tour, but also made sure that they framed the cabin in a particular way. In a lesson plan targeting students anywhere from 3rd to 12th grade, the opening line of the tour became a serious call to remembrance. We are about to enter the slave cabin. This is a real slave cabin. What does real mean? People really lived here, not fake, nonfiction. So we need to be respectful when we are in this place. No joking or wisecracks. Another serious matter curators continue to struggle with is the fact that Magnolia Mound, now a 16-acre site, used to encompass 950 acres. The size of the site isn't so much a problem, but the research staff is now certain that the private homes abutting the property, nearest to the restored slave cabin, also happen to be built upon slaves' unmarked graves. Perhaps the most powerful site of mortal anonymity in Louisiana, however, is found on the edge of downtown New Orleans in Treme, the city's 6th ward. Often referred to as the long-timer historic home to New Orleans' black populations, there are several sites related to the black past within blocks of each other. But it is a small memorial that is outside the church that speaks loudest in the horror of absence, that speaks loudest to the horror of absence. At first glance, the memorial looks like a small garden with a curious set of crosses planted in it. But with time, it becomes clear that a powerful force is at work. There are multiple small crosses of various sizes and design planted among the tropical grasses. Looming over them is a massive cross. It leans at a 45-degree angle and appears to have been made out of a ship's anchor chain. Tangled in this cross, this chain, are half a dozen slave shackles, some intact, some broken. This site is the tomb of the unknown slave. Dedicated on October 30, 2004, the St. Augustine community created this site to honor the memory of the nameless, faceless, turfless Africans who died in Treme. More than this, however, the shrine was a call to remember all slaves who lie buried in unmarked graves. The tomb's memorial plaque, which you can see just on the just right here. The tomb's memorial plaque acknowledges that the tomb tells a story that is as boundless as its subjects are nameless. I quote, "There is no doubt that the campus of St. Augustine Church sits astride the blood, sweat, tears, and some of the mortal remains of the unknown slaves from Africa and local American Indian slaves. In other words, the tomb of the unknown slave is a constant reminder that we are walking on holy ground. Thus, we cannot consecrate this tomb because it is already consecrated by many slaves' inglorious deaths, bereft of any acknowledgement, dignity, or respect." As a site of historical performance, the tomb of the unknown slave is a powerful marker of loss, absence, injustice, and cruelty. Although based in historical fact, it is, in the end, a figurative assertion of how the known can surround us but remain unknown. The literal invisibility of the bones is used as a reminder of the terrible labor through which the U.S. South was built. Bridgetown, Barbados. Questions relating to the presence or absence of an enslaved past are even more troubling in the Caribbean. The plantation economies and the epidemiological hazards of the tropical climate meant that life for slaves was unusually treacherous. If the brutality of the sugarcane production didn't cripple or kill you, insect-borne disease could easily do the job. As such, the Caribbean is fundamentally acquainted with the Louisianan problems connected to mortal anonymity and the ways in which these silences from the past can shape the present. These problems take on extra layers of complexity in the Caribbean, however, as many of the islands have been undergoing their own narrative transformations as far as their national identity is concerned. Beginning in the mid-1960s and continuing through the mid-1980s, many islands in the Caribbean began to sever their colonial ties and secure their independence. In each instance, the move to independence meant an accompanying ideological battle over the narrative of the nation. Often these battles were articulated in public sites of history, but the arrival of that debate took longer than one might expect. Kevin Farmer, Deputy Director of the Barbados Museum and Historical Society, explains that during the colonial era, Caribbean museums reflected a, quote, Victorian desire to explain the world through science and to exhibit its progress. As a result, science, order, and technology were juxtaposed, and I quote here, against all that was primitive. This dichotomy meant that invariably what was presented indicated that all that was European was superior and all that was not, for example, Amerindian, African, and Asian, was inferior, end quote. Logic would suggest that post-colonial governments would replace this sensibility with one that pointed to the contributions of their, quote, inferior populations. Instead, an aggressive push toward economic development and an even more aggressive courtship of the tourist dollar meant that Afro-Caribbean cultural practices, many of which existed as vehicles of protest against planter elites, were either suppressed or stripped of their anti-establishment critique. In Barbados, for example, its 1966 independence initiated a conversation about the role of Afro-Barbadians in the making of the modern island nation. Masquerade, a sociocultural performance based in African diasporic traditions and central to the Afro-Barbadian history and sensibility, would have been a logical starting point for Barbados museums to connect a known past with large and colorful artifacts available for display and interpretation. This would have been a perfect place for these museums to connect a known past to the Barbadian national identity. Very soon after independence, however, it became clear that the conversation was going to run in one direction only, toward the tourist economy. Hotel managers, for example, sought out masquerade performances, but only if the dancers desexualized their movements, got rid of so-called ugly masks, and eliminated those elements that involved effigies of the white planter elite. Over time, even the Africanity of certain masquerade traditions began to fade, and references to the British origins of masquerade began to appear. The marginalization of masquerade, a performance, quote, filled with ancestral ammunition for the battle of identity formation, has been real. Cultural studies scholar Marcia Burrows points out that many present-day Barbadians do not even know that what they believe to be authentic Afro-Barbadian masquerade is typically far removed from the masquerades of the pre-independence era. In recent years, the Barbados Museum and Historical Society has made earnest efforts to address this absence and to acquaint all Barbadians with their deep connections to African traditions and heritage. One of the museum's 8 galleries, opened in 2005, is titled Africa, Connections and Continuities. As it happens, 2 of the key artifacts in the gallery are full-size masquerade displays. He's taller than I am. Unfortunately, at many other cultural sites in Barbados that explore the country's past, there seems to be a commitment to do anything but acknowledge the African slave trade and the daily punishments of slave life on the island's sugarcane plantation. This much is made plain at one of the island's principal heritage tourist attractions, Sunbury Plantation House. The Sunbury Plantation House was built in the mid-17th century on land deeded to one of the first European settlers on the island. Although the sugarcane fields are still there, the house is now a separately owned property that is open for tours, regular lunchtime meals, twice weekly private dinners, and for weddings and receptions. The property managers take obvious pride in the physical plant. It is beautiful, especially the extensive reconstruction and restoration following a devastating fire in 1995. The house features exquisite period furniture, a special collection of optometric equipment, a hobby of an earlier owner, another collection of horse-drawn carriages, a hobby of a different owner, an impressive selection of hand-drawn art that features African slaves in parade dress and costumes, like the one I began with, and an equally impressive array of tools that were used by workers in the house, the gardens, and the fields. Following curator scripts, tour guides will tell the visitor everything there is to know about the many plantation owners and about the house's decor. The guides, however, make no mention of the lithographs featuring slaves. Neither do they address the fact that slaves used the tools that are on display. In fact, visitors will not hear a word about slaves or slavery at Sunbury House, only workers. Considering the fact that there were over 200 slaves working at Sunbury prior to emancipation, the narrative choice is striking. This curatorial commitment to omission is perfectly in line with the text one finds at the Sunbury Plantation House website that helps potential visitors learn what they will experience. And I quote, "In the extensively landscaped grounds are more fine, authentic examples of old carts and machinery used in the last century to cultivate the land. Sunbury Plantation House, located in the tranquil St. Philip countryside, is a living monument to plantation life of a bygone era, carefully restored and lovingly cherished by its owners for posterity, for the enjoyment of generations to come." Sunbury, end quote. Sunbury Plantation House is clearly preserved and marketed with a certain kind of tourist in mind. Although the house and grounds could easily offer any number of extended consideration of the relationship of forced labor to the island's political economy, and in turn, that labor's relationship to the economies of Atlantic Empire, there appears to be more money to be made by offering the house as an example of historicized leisure. Indeed, on the website that invites the virtual visitor to experience the past in its restored glory, there are only 3 short sentences that make any reference to slavery. One sentence details who owned the house during the slave rebellion of 1816. One indicates how much damage the house sustained during this rebellion. And a final one mentions that the leader of the rebellion at Sunbury was a friend of Busa, the island-wide rebellion leader. It makes sense that Busa is mentioned on the website, since he is far and away the most famous slave in Barbados' history. In fact, he is the only enslaved person who is memorialized in Barbados' National Heroes Gallery. Mentions or representations of Busa can be found elsewhere in the island, notably in the Emancipation statue, a figure of a man in triumphant pose with broken shackles still attached to his wrists. But it is important to note that talking about Busa, who was captured and killed for leading the rebellion, by the way, is not equivalent to talking about slavery. Indeed, the scope and quality of Africans' life in Barbados prior to the emancipatory moment remains rare. As long as the tourist and wedding and reception dollars flow so easily to major attractions like Sunbury Plantation House that stubbornly insist on preserving absence, it is hard to imagine that any substantive change will come soon. In Silencing the Past, Power and Production in History, Haitian historian and anthropologist Michel Rolfe-Trouillot asked broad questions about the relationship between absence, power, memory, and history. Trouillot used the almost complete silences around the Haitian Revolution, the largest slave rebellion in the West, to demand we think carefully about how we craft state-sanctioned individual and collective histories. In so doing, Trouillot was urging an examination of ambivalence, erasure, and forgetfulness. He wanted to know how things that happen begin to unhappen, when people or the state become committed to not telling stories of horror, trauma, institutional disgrace, or personal degradation. Even though curators had started to develop new exhibits in institutional homes in the late 1960s to counter this unhappening, it has only been since the mid-1990s that museum professionals began to probe more aggressively, plumbing their own collections for the absences a previous generation took as unrelenting fact. The pace, intensity, and breadth of this curiosity varies, but it is not unimportant that this work has been happening throughout the Black Atlantic world. Taking the Black Atlantic seriously has meant that interpreters of the past have had to ask questions about the shifting relationship between geography and race, about the textured nuances of cultural and political networks that are simultaneously local and global, and most importantly, about the need to resist capitulation to the pressures of absence. This approach has demanded, at times, imaginative recoveries that at some level acknowledge a past which can never be reclaimed, but that nonetheless remains central to the formation of a modern identity connected to ideas of trauma, rupture, and loss. This analytical approach, however, is not universally embraced, especially when the theoretical and archival work that a Black Atlantic perspective demands is superseded by the lure of profits. but the story of that kind of resistance to a more complicated notion of the past and present is a very old phenomenon, and, one fears, far more persuasive to stakeholders who have a literal and figurative investment in a status quo in which the absent simply remains that way. Thank you very much. Thank you. You need the microphone?
Thank you, Dean Holloway, and I think that whole concept of curating silence is something that we continue to wrestle with in the Atlantic world on a daily basis, and Charleston as well, and I know at Drayton Hall. And thankful at Drayton Hall that we do have a group of educators, a group of staff, from archaeologists to interpreters, that are wrestling with this idea and beginning to flesh it out. So we may have names of individuals, and we're now only coming to grips with what their daily environment was, what their practices were, and we'll get there. We'll continue to flesh it out. So thank you. Are there any questions for Jonathan? All right. Well, thank everybody for coming. Oh, here's one.
Yes, ma'am.
I just wanted to ask you about, you mentioned some of the issues that have come up, not directly you weren't talking about them, but in particular, I would like to bring up the resentment issue in America that's going on now with, politics, with people, with all of us. You know,
Yes.
we accumulate resentment from age one. As people, as human beings, and if we're not bubbling up some of this, and like you said, at the plantation, getting rid of some of this, then we keep it. We keep this these biases inside of us, and so I think this is great that you're here. I think that each person here, if we could have a conversation tomorrow with somebody about what was discussed tonight, I think it would be helpful to that. But what do you see as the communities across the country, the possibility of something that might also help with this issue of keeping people invisible?
When I think about this moment, I don't recognize this country, to be honest. I love this country. I also know it's deeply flawed. Okay, that's fair. I don't recognize this moment. So part of my answer, frankly, is I don't know, because things that would have derailed political campaigns in the past don't seem to faze anybody anymore. One of the things that we deal with at university administration levels, for the undergrads, we're dealing with 18 to 21-year-olds at a certain developmental moment in their life who are completely plugged in to these things. And I'm guilty of it as well, but not in the way that a 20-year-old is. And the smartphone, the social media world, does so many things that help. But my goodness, they do so much damage at the same time because they stop us from talking to one another. I don't have a grand answer to address our current political moment across the political spectrum. I think everybody's guilty, some more guilty than others. But I have no grand theory except for we need simply to talk to each other and to listen to each other. We need to find a way to be generous enough within ourselves to recognize somebody's complaint is not a personal attack. It's just a complaint, maybe. And it may be well-grounded and it may not, but it's not necessarily your fault. So it takes a bit of courage, I suppose, certainly generosity of spirit, to try to imagine what's going on with this person today that's led them to have this terrible moment. What's going on in a broader situation that led them to have a certain worldview. It takes a generosity of spirit and patience that is very difficult to have in a social media world. At Yale, I spent a lot of time talking about developing what's called a civic leadership program, civic engagement initiative. Goodness, civic leadership initiative. It's gone through different names. And it's basically a challenge to students to do just this. And through an annual conference and now through intermittent programs that the students are running themselves. I believe in lowercase democracy. A lot of great things happen in small groups like this where you can actually talk and listen to one another. It's our only way forward. And so the idea of going out and talking to somebody that you happen to know, whether it's an uncle or a daughter or a friend, and say, I heard this brilliant speaker last night. So start there. No, but just talk and listen. Talking is the easy part, actually. Being quiet enough to listen is the difficult part. And I think if we listen better with that generous spirit, we'll actually go a long way. But goodness, I don't know how to do it beyond a small room. I don't. I wish I did. I would tell you if I did. Yes, ma'am.
I'm curious to know, you spoke very frankly.
Yes.
And as an African American, I was most pleased to hear that.
Thank you.
I ask you though, what has been your reception when you are as frank as you are, especially in the South or in other parts of the country? Do you find a different reception?
I will confess that I was nervous about this talk. In fact, when I was officially invited, there's a scholar who studies slavery. I study a more contemporary moment, named Joseph Holloway. And so I was invited, looked at the Drayton Hall lecture series, and I'm like, yeah, they were meaning to write to Joseph Holloway. So this was not, so I wrote back Steve, I'm like, I found a polite way of saying, feel free to revoke the invitation because you're looking for this other person. He goes, no, I want you to come. I didn't know what the Drayton Hall Yale connection from it was the 1 year I couldn't participate in the program. I participated in it every summer. And then I suggested what I'd be writing about, thinking, okay, well, that will get me uninvited, certainly. And no, he said, no, bring it on. I'm like, okay. So I confessed to being I was a little bit nervous. But as I tell my students, so one thing is I don't get to be Professor Holloway that often anymore. As full-time dean, I'm on that campus trying to run Yale College. So I don't get on the road that much. When I get on the road, I do fundraising to Yale donors who actually, they already like the place, thankfully, and they want to talk with me. Some of them are very angry at the administration based on last semester, but they actually believe in the place so much they want to talk about it. And so we actually make some progress in those settings. But something I've told my students when they were quite literally in my face this past fall, it's like, I will always be honest with you. And you may not like at all what I have to say. In fact, you may consider me a sellout, or you might think of this, I'm like, I don't like that, but I will always be honest. I don't want to walk around trying to remember my lies, frankly. And I'd much rather be in a place that would, around people who frankly disagree with me, instead of who are just being polite and waiting for me to leave and say something behind my back. Now, I hope I didn't describe this room. But I think it's just, you've got to be honest and accept the consequences of that honesty. It's the only way to live. And so I've not gone around to tell this story that often, but I did, this is a shameless pitch, I published a book called Jim Crow Wisdom, and I did travel around a fair bit then, doing sort of what passes in university world for a book tour. 6 places in cube cheese and a cracker. But what was really meaningful to me is that I think there is such a desire for honest conversations, whether you agree or not with the person, that when I was telling stories, there's a book about black memories since 1940 and the stories that blacks have told about their past for the sake of their future and their present, is that when people came to the readings, they didn't know what to expect, but they would listen to the talk or read part of the book. It's like, that's my story you just told. And it wasn't necessarily a black person who said it. It was a person whose parents were immigrants. and stories of trauma of trying to fit in, of trying to be a citizen, stories of trying to control behavior. Sir, I'll come right to you next. Those stories are human stories that in my case are written from a black perspective. But so audience were like, wow, there's something in my past, my Irish past, my Czechoslovakian past, my Jewish past, that relates to this past. I actually think there is so much more that we share in common, regardless of our political positions, the color of our skin, our gender, or sexuality, than those things that separate us. But we obsess over the separations. And that is a shame. And it makes us all weaker. That's the stuff I talk about. I believe in it. Sir.
I appreciate the term you use, curating silence. My name is Joseph. I'm a father of the state of Barbados. I go around this nation finding places that curate silence and bring attention to those places. My question to you, Yale Law School just took a position on Isaac Ward and his association with Yale Law School. They, from the information that they found in his association with slavery, I think this decision is to disassociate. Am I correct on that?
Are you talking about the Harvard Law School?
Excuse me, Yale. I'm sorry.
Harvard.
Is it Harvard?
Yeah.
Okay.
They changed for the press.
Harvard Law School. What's your opinion on such a move to disassociate with those who are associated with slavery and trying to disassociate themselves to institutions of higher learning?
Thank you for the question. This is a reference to the Harvard Law School recommending and the Harvard Corporation accepting the recommendation to change, I don't know if they're changing it too, but changing the law school crest, which had 3 sheaths of hay, I believe it was hay, which was a reference to the plantation economy that was basically funding early Harvard law. So it's funny you should ask this question. This is something I've been living with a lot this year and actually in previous years. So Yale has a system of residential colleges. When you are admitted to Yale and decide to come, you are assigned randomly one of these colleges. And as Rachel, my dear friend, can attest, she was assigned to Calhoun College, as in John C. Calhoun College. I was the master of John C. Calhoun College. Calhoun is a Yale alum, Vice President of the United States, Senator from South Carolina. He had some ideas about race and slavery. That... He never did? That's probably another story, isn't it? But so Yale decided in 1932, the Yale Board of Trustees, the corporation, they were creating these residential colleges, and they were going to name them after, 5 of them after the leading sons of Eli. This is a quote from, these are strange nomenclatures, in the world of religion and politics in these different areas. And they thought their most important alum in the world of politics was John C. Calhoun. Now, Calhoun had been the Vice President of the United States. He had been a sitting senator, very powerful individual who had his very particular strong views. But the views didn't really matter to the corporation in the 1930s. Well, they matter now to a different generation. Yale looked quite different now than it did, heck, 25 years ago. And so there's a conversation on campus about should the Calhoun College retain its name. Now, I officially have no opinion because it's happening right now, this debate. It actually goes before the corporation for a final decision in 2 weeks, actually. But I will tell you how I was quoted in the Yale Alumni Magazine 4 years ago. And I'm not trying to be coy, I have to have no opinion in this moment. But 4 years ago, when I was asked about the name of the college, I had, paraphrasing this much to say, I'm no fan of John C. Calhoun, nor would he be a fan of me. That is absolutely the case. He could not have imagined me, actually, which is probably the more damning thing. And I'm no fan of him, but I didn't like the idea of changing the name of the college. Not that I liked the name, but being in Calhoun for me was not about John C. Calhoun at all. It was about meeting Rachel. Are there any other Hoonies here? Rachel's the only one I know. But Hoonies across the generations are all very dear to me. I have a deep bias. I spent 9 years there, raised my family in that space. Calhoun was a place where students met and debated and fell in love and had parties until too late in the morning, and I had to break them up. But they would be students, young people that we were nurturing to help try to change the world, frankly. The name to the students really didn't mean, the students, I'm embarrassed to say, didn't even know who John C. Calhoun was. Okay. Now, Rachel probably did, coming from this area of the country, but most people didn't. That's its own problem. But the real problem for me is that, much as I love this country, I'm a historian by training, and this country is too much in love with its own amnesia. That it loves to celebrate its exceptionalism. I believe it's an exceptional country because of the way in which people have survived these horrible, terrible things. And somehow this country still holds together. That's astonishing. There's no other place on this planet with a history like that. But boy, we need to be strong enough and brave enough to accept the great things that we do in terms of our nation's history and the really bad things. And if we start taking names off of buildings, as I said 4 years ago, I worry that we will simply feel too good about ourselves all the time. And I don't want to go down that road. And I love, heck, I'm the dean of Yale College. I'm a cheerleader for the institution. But I will tell you, I do not trust it enough that if it starts to changing names, that it won't become self-satisfied. And Yale's history, its recent history in the last 50 years, is filled with quotas to keep Jewish students capped, keep them out. It's about not letting women there in the college until basically 1969. It's about really not admitting blacks in any appreciable numbers till around the same moment. It's about lots of things that are really, in the light of today, are pretty shameful things. It is still a great institution, though, because its values have changed over time. We need to recognize all of that and recognize how exceptional we are. Having said all of that, when this massacre happened a few blocks away this summer, and I'm being completely honest, and when the South Carolina legislative leadership claimed it was an act of an anti-Christian act instead of an act of white supremacy, my faith in the possibility of our leaders to have an honest conversation, even when it was ugly, got crippled. Like, if we can't talk about this obvious act, this is before Facebook revealed, the Confederate battle flags. If we can't have an obvious a conversation about an obvious intransigence, what are we going to do? So my determination to fight historical amnesia got shaken this summer out of just despair and frustration. But I'm an eternal optimist, frankly. I have to be. So I'm willing to roll the dice. See, I wasn't going to give you my opinion. Here I am giving my opinion. I'm willing to roll the dice that we can be mature enough to take in all those really shameful things about who we are and demonstrate our resilience and be better for it. It is difficult. It is painful. But you can't be great without doing painful and difficult things.
I agree with